In the northern reaches of Yorkshire, cradled between low-lying hills and endless stretches of moorland, lay the village of Eversfield, a place that time seemed to have forgotten. Its narrow cobblestone streets wound through clusters of stone cottages with thatched roofs, each chimney breathing thin plumes of smoke into the cold morning air. The church bell, weather-worn and cracked, tolled at dawn and dusk, marking the rhythm of life for the 70-odd souls who called Eversfield home. The year was 1871, and though the world beyond was changing, railways slicing through distant towns, factories rising like iron giants, Eversfield remained still, suspended between the old ways and the whisper of a new age. The people here worked with their hands and believed in the land beneath their feet. Their lives were slow but steady, their joys simple yet sincere. Among them lived Thomas Hale, a man of middle years whose calm nature had earned him quiet respect from everyone who knew him. He was a carpenter by trade, known for building strong oak furniture that lasted generations. When the villagers needed a new table, a cradle, or even a coffin, it was to Thomas they turned. He worked from a small workshop at the edge of the village, where the smell of sawdust and pine sap lingered like perfume. From sunrise to sunset, the soft rhythm of his hammer and chisel was a familiar sound, a heartbeat of Eversfield itself. Thomas was not a man of many words. He preferred silence, not from pride but from a kind of inward peace. Those who spoke with him found his manner gentle and his smile genuine, though tinged with the quiet sadness that often comes from a life of humble endurance. He had known loss before, a younger brother taken by fever and a father buried after an accident in the quarry. Yet these sorrows had carved depth into his character, not bitterness. His wife, Margaret Hale, was the opposite of his stillness, light where he was shadow, melody where he was silence. She had once been a schoolteacher in a nearby village before marrying Thomas at the age of 26. Her kindness made her beloved in Eversfield. Children ran to her gate to listen to her stories. The elderly sought her company for comfort and tea. Her voice was gentle and warm, and when she sang hymns on Sunday mornings, even the most restless souls in the pews seemed to settle. Their cottage, a modest two-room home of grey stone, stood beside a small stream that murmured softly through the meadow. In summer, the garden behind it bloomed with hollyhocks and lavender, and Margaret's hands were always busy pruning, watering, or arranging flowers in small vases around the house. In winter, when frost clung to the windows and the days shortened, Thomas would light the hearth while Margaret prepared soup or baked bread, filling the cottage with the comforting aroma of home. For 19 years they had lived side by side, never wealthy but never in want. They shared everything, from the smallest household chore to their quiet evening rituals. After supper, Thomas would sit by the window with a cup of tea, while Margaret mended clothes or read aloud from her worn copy of the Book of Common Prayer. Sometimes she read poetry. She loved Wordsworth, and Thomas, who could barely read more than a few lines himself, listened in silent awe. "Do you ever tire of hearing the same verses?" she once asked him, smiling. "Never," he replied, resting his rough hands on hers. "Every time you read them, they sound new." The villagers often remarked that the Hales seemed born for each other. In a world where many marriages were built on duty or necessity, theirs was something gentler, a companionship grounded in mutual respect and affection. On Sundays, they could be seen walking arm in arm down the church path, Margaret with her bonnet tied neatly beneath her chin, Thomas carrying a small Bible she had given him on their 5th anniversary. When he looked at her, his eyes softened in a way that words could not describe. Eversfield itself moved to the rhythm of the seasons. Spring brought the bleating of lambs and the scent of damp earth. Summer filled the meadows with wildflowers and children's laughter. Autumn arrived like an old friend, with amber leaves and the smoke of burning wood curling from every chimney. And then came winter, long, grey, and merciless. The villagers knew how to endure it, bundling together in faith and fellowship. But in 1871, the cold came early, and it came hard. By mid-November, the moors were already blanketed in frost. The stream near the Hale cottage began to freeze around its edges, and the days grew shorter, the nights unbearably still. Yet even then, life inside their small home was warm. Margaret would sit close to the fire, humming softly as Thomas repaired tools or sanded pieces of wood by candlelight. They found contentment in these quiet moments, two souls bound not by grand gestures but by the small, faithful rhythm of ordinary love. The village folk often said that Eversfield's strength came from such people, those who worked honestly, loved quietly, and asked little from the world. To outsiders, the place might have seemed dull or forgotten, but to its inhabitants it was a sanctuary. In a time when the world was growing loud and restless, Eversfield remained a haven of peace, a reminder that simplicity could still hold beauty. No one could have guessed that within months, tragedy would strike that peaceful home, that the love which seemed so steady would soon be tested by a grief too heavy for one heart to bear. Yet even before sorrow cast its shadow, those who knew Thomas and Margaret sensed something eternal in them. Their love felt like part of the land itself, quiet, enduring, and deeply rooted. And so, as the winter of 1871 descended over the moors and the first snow began to fall upon Eversfield, the small cottage by the stream glowed with the gentle light of two hearts that had found, in each other, their only home. The year 1871 settled over Eversfield like a heavy blanket of grey. By late December the skies had turned the colour of pewter, and frost clung stubbornly to every fence post and rooftop. Even the stream that wound behind the Hale cottage froze in silence, its ripples captured mid-motion beneath a skin of ice. Winter in northern Yorkshire was always harsh, but that year it came earlier, colder, and crueler than anyone could remember. Thomas Hale woke before sunrise each morning, breaking ice from the well and lighting the fire before his wife stirred. The cottage, though small, was well kept. He had built much of it with his own hands, sealing the cracks against the moor wind. Inside, the smell of wood smoke mingled with dried herbs Margaret had hung to dry months earlier. Their home, so full of warmth in spirit, now stood like a fragile fortress against the encroaching cold. Margaret Hale had always been strong for her size, with bright eyes and a soft but steady step. She loved winter for its quiet beauty, the way snow fell like a hush upon the fields, the way candlelight flickered against the frost on the panes. But as January wore on, her strength began to wane. It started with small things, a cough that came in the evenings, a chill that no fire could seem to chase away. At first, she dismissed it with a smile. "It's only the season, Thomas," she'd say, wrapping her shawl tighter. "A bit of broth and I'll be right as rain." But Thomas noticed how her voice began to rasp, how her hands trembled as she poured tea. Each night, as the wind moaned through the chimney, her coughing grew harsher. Still, she refused to rest. She kept tending to her garden pots indoors, arranging dried lavender and thyme, humming the same soft hymns that had once filled the house with life. When February came, the illness deepened. What had been a simple cough turned to lung fever, a sickness that moved swiftly through the countryside that winter. The doctor in the neighboring town was already overwhelmed. By the time he reached the Hale cottage, Margaret was pale and fevered, her breathing shallow. He examined her by candlelight and left behind a small bottle of tincture, his face grave. "Keep her warm," he told Thomas quietly at the door. "And pray, Mr. Hale. Pray with all your heart." Thomas did pray. Every night he knelt by her bedside, whispering words half remembered from the church services she loved. He pressed cool cloths to her forehead, spooned water between her lips, and held her hand when the fever raged. For days she drifted between waking and sleep, calling out his name in delirium. The sound of her pain tore through him, but he never left her side. Outside, snow fell without mercy. The roads to the village grew impassable, isolating them completely. Their woodpile dwindled, and Thomas worked through the nights to keep the fire burning. His rough carpenter's hands, used to shaping oak and pine, now trembled as he wrung out cloths and measured medicine. His world had narrowed to that small, dimly lit room, the bed where she lay, the chair where he sat, and the silence that stretched between her labored breaths. In rare lucid moments, Margaret would look at him and smile faintly. "You've always taken such care of me," she whispered once, her voice thin as thread. "Do you remember our first spring here? How you built that gate for the garden because I said the rabbits would steal my cabbages?" Thomas nodded, his throat too tight to speak. I remember, he managed, and I'll mend it again come spring. Then I must get well, she said softly. I can't let the rabbits win. But spring never came for her. By the second week of February, the fever had burned through her strength. The doctor returned once, trudging through knee-deep snow, only to shake his head. She's weak,
Mr. Hale,
he said quietly. There's not much more we can do. Thomas refused to believe him. He sat beside her, reading aloud from the small book of Psalms she kept on her nightstand. He read through the nights until his voice broke and the candle guttered out. Still he read, because he could not imagine silence between them. On the evening of February 17, 1871, the storm outside eased for the first time in days. The wind stilled, and the snow glittered under a pale half-moon. Inside, Margaret stirred weakly and reached for his hand. Her skin was cool to the touch. Thomas, she whispered, promise me something.
Anything, love.
Don't leave me alone. Not now. Not after. You'll get better, he said, trying to smile. You'll see. She shook her head gently. No, my time's come. I feel it. But promise me you won't let me go alone. His chest ached as he leaned close. I won't, he said, the words trembling. I'll stay beside you. She smiled faintly then, a soft, peaceful smile, and for a moment, she seemed no longer in pain. Her eyes closed, her breathing slowed, and with one last sigh that sounded almost like a prayer, Margaret Hale slipped away. For several minutes, Thomas did not move. He sat there holding her hand, waiting for the next breath that never came. Outside, the first light snow of the evening began to fall again, covering the frozen fields like a shroud. He could hear the faint creak of the rafters, the whisper of wind beneath the door, and nothing else. When at last he spoke, it was not a cry but a whisper, quiet, broken, and full of disbelief. You said not to leave you? He murmured, pressing his forehead to her still hand. And I won't. That night he lit every candle in the house. The warm glow flickered over her face, gentle and serene. He brushed her hair back, fixed her blanket, and sat by her side, watching the flame dance. He could not bear to close her eyes or call for help. To him she was not gone, only resting, waiting for him to keep his promise. And so began the long vigil of a man whose love refused to accept death's final word. For the first few hours after Margaret's passing, Thomas Hale sat motionless in the chair beside her bed. The fire in the hearth burned low, its embers glowing faintly, casting long shadows across the cottage walls. Outside, the world was still, so still that he could hear the faint ticking of the small clock on the mantelpiece, each second marking the impossible truth that time had not stopped, even though his heart had. It did not seem real. Her face was calm, almost peaceful, and for a fleeting moment, he convinced himself she was merely asleep. He leaned forward, listening for breath, waiting for the small rise of her chest. But the stillness remained, no sound, no warmth, only silence. He whispered her name again and again, softly at first, then louder, as though calling might bring her back. Margaret, my love, come back to me. When no answer came, Thomas lowered his head onto her chest and wept like a man who had never cried before. The tears soaked through her nightdress, his body shaking with grief. Outside, snow continued to fall, gentle and relentless, blanketing the moors in silence. The night bled into morning, though he hardly noticed. The gray light of dawn crept through the curtains, revealing the small details of their life together. Her slippers by the hearth, a teacup still on the table, the shawl she had worn just days before. Each item was a memory frozen in place, too sacred to move. When the fire finally died, he stirred only to fetch more wood. He moved as if in a trance, tending to her as he had done in life. He washed her face with warm water, brushed her hair carefully, and placed her hands across her chest. The tenderness with which he moved was heartbreaking. He was not preparing her for burial. He was caring for her, keeping his promise. You said not to leave you, he whispered, and I won't. Days passed in this strange, suspended world. He did not eat much, only what was necessary to stay awake. He lit candles around her bed each evening, praying softly, singing the hymns she had once loved. When he felt her hand growing colder, he covered it with a cloth, as if she might warm again. He did not call for the doctor. He did not send word to the neighbors. In his mind, death had not truly claimed her yet. He believed that love, strong, unbroken, pure, could hold her near long enough for God to take pity and return her breath. The village outside went on as always. Smoke rose from chimneys, carts rattled down the lanes, the church bell rang for Sunday prayers. Some noticed that Thomas had not been seen in weeks, but few thought to worry. It was winter, people stayed indoors. The Hales were private folk. It was not unusual for them to keep to themselves. Inside the cottage, the air grew stiller each day. The smell of smoke and tallow candles hung heavy, mingled now with a faint sweetness. The scent of time standing still. The clock on the mantelpiece had stopped, perhaps out of neglect, perhaps by some strange mercy. The world inside that cottage no longer obeyed the same laws as the world outside. Sometimes Thomas spoke to her softly, as if carrying on the conversations they'd always had. "Mended the table leg today, Margaret," he'd say. "You always said it wobbled. It doesn't now." Other times, he read aloud from her book of poems, his voice trembling. "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds." He read one night, pausing as tears blurred the page. "You believed that, didn't you? That love endures." He took small comfort in those words, clinging to them as one clings to a raft in a storm. Each day that passed felt both endless and necessary, as though his vigil had purpose, as though she might yet wake if only he loved her enough. On the 10th day, the snow outside melted slightly, and a neighbor, Eleanor Bright, passed by on her way to the well. She noticed no smoke from the Hale chimney and frowned. She thought of stopping, but the cold wind pushed her homeward. It would be another week before she returned. Another week of silence. By the second week, Thomas's hands had grown weak from exhaustion. He had stopped shaving, stopped sleeping properly. His eyes were hollow yet gentle, and he still spoke to her as though she were alive. He made her tea in the mornings, pouring it into her favorite cup and setting it by her bedside. In the evenings, he sat close, telling her stories of their early years. The spring they'd met, the summer they'd built the garden gate, the autumn they'd harvested turnips side by side. Every detail, every memory was a lifeline. He was not living in denial so much as refusing to abandon love. Sometimes, he would feel a flicker of fear, a thought that what he was doing was not right, but it would vanish the moment he looked at her face. She still seemed beautiful, untroubled, as if she might open her eyes at any moment. The lines of illness had softened, and the peace that death had left behind looked almost like sleep. He took that as a sign, a small mercy from heaven. He spoke to God too, though not as the priest would have wished. "If you must take her," he prayed one night, "then take me too. Don't leave me here alone." But no answer came, only the sigh of wind against the window and the whisper of ashes settling in the grate. When the third week began, the silence inside the cottage was complete. It had become a world apart. No time, no sound, only the hum of love's persistence. The few who passed along the road thought the Hales had gone to stay with kin, or that illness had kept them indoors. No one yet understood that tragedy sat quietly among them, and still Thomas stayed. Each day he would open the curtains just enough for a sliver of daylight to touch her face. "You always loved the morning light," he would say softly. Then he would sit beside her once more, his hand resting on hers, waiting, not for death to leave, but for love to keep its promise. He did not count the days anymore. They blurred together into a single, endless night of devotion. In the heart of that silence, he was no longer aware of the world beyond the cottage walls. He had entered a different kind of eternity. One built not of time, but of faith and love too deep to let go. By the time the 23rd day had passed since Margaret Hale drew her last breath, the world beyond the cottage had begun to stir with the first hints of spring. The snow that had blanketed Eversfield through February was loosening its grip. Thin rivulets of meltwater trickled through the cobblestones, and the sound of church bells once again drifted across the moors. Life was returning to the village, but not to the small stone house by the stream. Inside, Thomas Hale still kept his vigil. The air was heavy and still, the faint smell of candle wax mingling with the scent of wilted flowers he had placed in a jar by her bedside. The curtains were half drawn, letting in just enough light to make the room appear suspended between day and night. Margaret lay where she always had, covered neatly with the quilt she had sewn herself the previous autumn. Her face, pale and serene, was framed by her long brown hair. To Thomas, she looked no different than she had the morning after she died. He no longer measured time in hours or days. The sun rose and he lit the candles. The sun set and he lit them again. His world had shrunk to the space between his chair and her still body, between the whispers of memory and the echo of his own breathing. He spoke to her softly, telling her of the weather, of the birds returning to the trees, of how the frost on the window had begun to fade. "The robins are back, love," he said one morning, brushing the hair from her forehead. "You said they'd be the first to sing again. You were right." He smiled faintly, waiting for her answer, for a twitch of her fingers, for some sign that she still heard him. When none came, he bowed his head and wept quietly, his tears falling onto her quilt. Meanwhile, in the village, the absence of Thomas Hale had begun to stir concern. He had not collected his pay for a carpentry job completed weeks ago. The postman, finding letters piling up by his gate, mentioned it at the tavern. And it was Eleanor Bright, the widow who lived 2 cottages down, who finally decided something must be done. Eleanor was a woman of middle years, sharp of eye and firm of heart. She had lost her own husband to a mining accident a decade before, and grief had taught her to recognize its shadow in others. On that pale March morning, she pulled on her shawl and set off along the narrow path toward the Hale cottage, her boots crunching over the thawing ground. When she reached the gate, she noticed the silence first. No smoke from the chimney, no movement in the windows, no sound of hammer or saw. She knocked once on the door, gently. Tap, tap, tap. No reply. She waited, listening. Somewhere inside, she thought she heard movement, perhaps the shifting of a chair. She knocked again, louder this time. Thump, thump. Still nothing. The unease in her chest deepened. She pressed her ear to the door and called out, "Thomas, it's Eleanor Bright. Are you well in there?" A pause. Then, at last, the sound of slow, heavy footsteps approaching. The latch turned with a faint creak. The door opened just a crack, and Thomas appeared in the gap, pale and hollow-eyed. Eleanor's breath caught. He looked like a ghost himself, his beard untrimmed, his clothes wrinkled, his skin gray from sleepless nights. His eyes, once gentle and warm, had a faraway glaze. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, trying to mask her alarm. "I was worried. You've not been seen for weeks. Are you all right?" Thomas blinked as if her words reached him through a thick fog. "She's resting," he murmured. Eleanor frowned. "Who's resting?" He stepped back and opened the door wider. "Margaret," he said simply. The smell that met her as she stepped inside turned her stomach. A faint, sweet odor beneath the layers of candle smoke and cold air. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness, and then she saw the bed. Margaret Hale lay upon it, her hands folded over her chest, her face wax pale and perfectly still. The flowers beside her were wilted and brown. The air was thick with the silence of death. Eleanor gasped and covered her mouth. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh, my dear man." Thomas turned toward her with an expression of childlike confusion. "She's only resting," he said, his voice steady but distant. "The doctor said to keep her warm. She'll wake when she's ready." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. She wanted to speak, but her throat closed. The sight before her was unbearable. The devotion, the denial, the quiet madness born of love too deep to yield to reason. "Thomas," she said gently, taking a cautious step closer, "you've done all you could for her. But she's gone, love. You have to let her go now." He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "She asked me not to leave her alone. I gave her my word." His voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he might break down. But instead, he returned to the chair beside the bed and sat down, taking Margaret's hand in his. "She's not cold," he whispered. "Not to me." Eleanor stood there in helpless silence, tears sliding down her cheeks. She knew she could not handle this alone. Without a word, she stepped back outside and hurried down the path toward the village, her heart pounding. She fetched the constable and the parish priest, and together they returned to the Hale cottage. When they entered, Thomas did not resist. He only looked up at them with a weary calm. The constable removed his hat, bowing his head in respect. The priest whispered a prayer under his breath, and Thomas sat still beside his wife, holding her hand as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "I promised her," he said again, his voice barely more than a breath. "I promised I wouldn't let her be alone." It took them hours to persuade him to step outside, to allow them to prepare her for burial. Even then, as they led him from the room, he turned back again and again, his eyes fixed on her face. The villagers who gathered later that day spoke in hushed tones. Some said he had gone mad with grief, others whispered that such devotion was something holy. But all agreed on one thing: they had never seen love like that before, so steadfast, so sorrowful, so absolute. As the sun set over Eversfield that evening, the priest's words echoed softly through the cottage, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." And though Thomas Hale said nothing, a single tear slipped down his cheek. For the first time in weeks, he was no longer alone. The morning of Margaret Hale's burial dawned cold and windless. A faint mist curled through the valley of Eversfield, softening the outlines of cottages and hedgerows until everything looked like a half-remembered dream. Bells from St. Matthew's Church tolled slowly, their mournful sound rolling over the frozen fields. Each note seemed to weigh upon the air, pressing against the hearts of all who heard. At the cottage by the stream, Thomas Hale prepared for the journey he had dreaded since the moment his wife's breath had left her. The parish women had come the previous evening to wash and dress Margaret for her final rest. They had closed her eyes, combed her hair, and wrapped her in the lace shawl she had worn on their wedding day. Her wedding ring still shone faintly on her thin finger. Thomas had not allowed them to remove it. "It was," he said quietly, "the circle that never ends." Now he stood by the small pine coffin that the carpenter from the next village had built. He could have made it himself. No one in Eversfield doubted his skill, but he could not bring his hands to craft the box that would separate them forever. Instead, he had sanded the lid smooth and carved her initials with his trembling knife, M.H. Beloved wife. When the men came to lift the coffin, Thomas followed silently, his boots crunching over the thin crust of frost. He carried no hat, though the cold bit sharply at his ears and cheeks. In one hand, he clutched the small bouquet of dried lavender Margaret had tied months before, and in the other he held her prayer book. The villagers lined the narrow lane as the procession passed. Some wept openly, others bowed their heads in quiet respect. The sight of Thomas walking barefoot behind the coffin, his expression calm yet hollow, etched itself into every heart that witnessed it. It was not madness they saw in him, but something deeper, a love so complete it had crossed the fragile boundary between life and death. At the churchyard, the priest's voice quavered as he spoke the ancient words, "Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust." When the final clods of soil fell, Thomas stepped forward. He knelt by the grave and laid the lavender upon it. His lips moved, but his voice was too soft for anyone to hear. The priest placed a hand on his shoulder, murmuring that God would comfort him, yet Thomas only nodded faintly, his gaze fixed on the mound of earth before him. When the service ended, the others drifted away, but he remained. Dusk gathered around the graveyard, turning the headstones into silhouettes. Only when the last light faded did Thomas rise and begin the long walk home through the mist. Grief, the villagers soon learned, did not drive Thomas to despair. It turned him into something quieter, more solemn, almost monk-like. Each morning he walked to the churchyard before dawn, his rough hands clasped together, his eyes soft and faraway. He tended Margaret's grave as if it were a living thing, brushing away leaves, straightening the flowers, clearing the snow when it fell. In spring he planted forget-me-nots, saying she would have liked their color. He spoke to her as though she still listened. Sometimes, while kneeling in the damp earth, passers-by would hear his low murmur, "You should see the garden, love. The lilacs bloomed early this year." Other times, he read aloud from her old books, his voice breaking but steady. To him, those moments were not acts of sorrow but of companionship. He did not mourn Margaret as someone lost. He lived as though she waited just beyond sight. When work resumed at his carpentry shed, he returned to it slowly. The first pieces he made were simple crosses for the churchyard, one of them for her grave. Then came small chests and stools, all built with the same quiet precision as before. Yet something had changed in his craftsmanship. Each object bore delicate carvings, tiny vines, hearts, and verses that villagers said were prayers made wood. People spoke of him with reverence. Some pitied him, others envied the purity of his lodrov. Mothers told their children, "Mr. Hale's heart is still with his Margaret." And though the children whispered ghost stories about the man who talked to the dead, even they softened when they saw his gentle smile. In the second year after her death, Thomas began writing letters, short notes he folded carefully and buried beneath the soil at her grave. The first read simply, "The nights are long, but I still feel your hand in mine." He left one every Sunday. Sometimes they contained prayers, sometimes memories, a line from a hymn, a recipe she loved, a verse from scripture. The letters became his ritual, a bridge between two worlds. One spring morning, a village boy caught him placing a note in the ground and asked, half innocently, "Do you think she reads them, Mr. Hale?" Thomas smiled, his eyes glistening. "Every word," he said. "The soul has better sight than we do." The boy ran off, wide-eyed, and told everyone what he'd heard. From that day, no one teased Thomas again. Even the roughest men at the tavern lowered their voices when his name was mentioned. There was something sacred about him now, as if grief had transformed him into a living prayer. As the years passed, time softened the sharp edges of his sorrow but never erased them. His hair turned white, his step slower, yet his devotion never faltered. On the anniversary of her death each February, he placed fresh flowers on her grave, no matter how deep the snow. The villagers began to mark that day too, leaving small blossoms at their own loved ones, resting places in silent tribute to the carpenter who had taught them that love did not end at the grave. He refused to remarry, though several widows offered friendship and comfort. "My heart's spoken for," he would say gently, and none could argue. When strangers passed through Eversfield, they sometimes found him sitting by the churchyard wall at dusk, watching the fading light. They would nod politely, unaware they were looking at a man who had made peace with both love and loss. In 1882, after 11 years of quiet devotion, Thomas Hale's strength failed. One cold March evening, the priest found him sitting at Margaret's grave, his head bowed, hands folded as if in prayer. The snow had begun to fall again, lightly this time, dusting his shoulders and hair. He looked as though he were merely asleep beside her. They buried him next to Margaret 3 days later. On his gravestone, the villagers carved the words he had written in one of his letters: "Love does not end when breath does. It endures in silence, in memory, in faith." When spring came, the forget-me-nots bloomed in clusters over both graves, their blue petals swaying gently in the wind. And from that season onward, the people of Eversfield told their children about Thomas and Margaret Hale, the husband who kept his promise, the wife whose love never faded, and the lesson their lives had left behind, that love, when pure and steadfast, does not die, it simply waits. Years after Thomas Hale and his beloved Margaret were laid to rest, the village of Eversfield changed in ways the couple could never have imagined. New cottages rose, the cobbled lanes widened, and the young men who once watched Thomas walk to the churchyard each dawn grew into fathers and grandfathers themselves. Yet through all the shifting seasons, the story of the carpenter and his bride never faded. It lived quietly in the hearts of the people, passed from one generation to the next like a treasured keepsake. Children still paused by the twin graves near the church's stone wall, where blue forget-me-nots bloomed faithfully each spring. The flowers were not planted by any gardener now. They grew of their own accord, year after year, as if nature itself had vowed to remember. When travelers asked whose graves they were, the villagers always told the tale with the same gentle reverence. "They are Thomas and Margaret Hale, the ones who taught us what love truly means." And so, though the man himself had long since gone to join his wife, the lesson he left behind continued to shape lives. Quietly, tenderly, and profoundly, Thomas's life taught the people that love was not a fleeting passion, nor a fire that burned bright only to fade. To him, love was a covenant, one made not only with words, but with the steadfastness of action. His devotion during those long, lonely weeks beside his wife's lifeless body had first shocked the village, but with time, people began to see something deeper in it, the refusal to let the world dictate how grief should look. He had not been mad, as some whispered. He had simply loved beyond convenience, beyond time, beyond reason. His vigil had become a symbol, a testament that love, when pure, asks not for understanding but for faith. Young couples began to speak of the Hail Promise, a simple vow whispered at weddings in Eversfield for decades afterward. I will love you, even when the world no longer sees you. It became part of the village's soul, a reminder that love was not measured in years but in devotion that endures even in silence. In the small churchyard, people often visited Thomas's grave not just to grieve their own losses, but to find comfort. The local priest, who had once comforted Thomas himself, began preaching about him in his sermons, saying, "He built with wood, but he also built with faith. His workshop stood on earth, but his masterpiece was made in heaven, a love that time could not unmake." The priest's words resonated deeply. Over time, Eversfield became known for its compassion toward the widowed and the grieving. Neighbors who once turned away from sorrow now reached out with open arms. Women who lost their husbands found solace in the story of Margaret Hale's memory, and men who buried their wives remembered Thomas's quiet strength. The carpenter's name became a kind of prayer, a symbol of loyalty, patience, and the endurance of the human heart. Decades later, in 1912, a young boy named Edward Rowley found one of Thomas's old letters while tending the churchyard. The paper had survived inside a rusted tin box buried near the roots of a lilac bush. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. To my dearest Margaret, the nights grow longer, but I feel your presence in every beam of morning light. Love, it seems, is not something the grave can hold. It lingers in the air, in the quiet, in me. Until I see you again, Thomas. Edward ran home and showed the letter to his teacher, who had grown up hearing tales of the carpenter. The discovery revived the story in the village once more. The local paper even published it, calling it a letter that outlived its author. For Edward, the letter became a turning point. He grew up to be a writer, and years later, he penned a book titled The Man Who Waited, inspired by Thomas Hale's life. The book spoke of love not as a possession, but as a presence that never truly leaves. It was read far beyond Eversfield, carrying the message of the humble carpenter to countless hearts across the country. As decades turned to centuries, Eversfield modernized. The thatched cottages gave way to brick homes, and the sound of horse hooves was replaced by the hum of engines. Yet the churchyard remained untouched, its ancient yew trees standing sentinel over the graves. The story of Thomas and Margaret endured, told by grandparents at firesides and teachers in classrooms, reminding the young that even in a world chasing speed and progress, the truest things still belong to the heart. Historians later wrote about Thomas Hale as one of those forgotten figures whose quiet acts had shaped local culture. In museum displays about rural life in the 19th century, his tools were preserved: a chisel, a wooden mallet, a small box carved with vines and hearts. Beneath them, a plaque read, Thomas Hale, carpenter of Eversfield's 1882. His hands shaped wood, but his heart shaped faith. Visitors often lingered there longer than they expected. Some left flowers beside the display. Others simply stood in silence, moved by the idea that such ordinary love could achieve something eternal. The greatest lesson Thomas Hale left was not how to mourn, but how to live, with gentleness, gratitude, and enduring devotion. He had shown that grief could be transformed into grace, that even the darkest winters of life could yield blossoms of hope. People began to see love not as a fleeting emotion, but as a practice, a daily act of care, patience, and remembrance. His story became a quiet rebellion against the rush of forgetting. It taught that to remember someone truly is to keep them alive in how we live, how we speak, and how we love others. In Eversfield, when couples argued, it was not uncommon to hear an elder say softly, "Think of Thomas and Margaret," and somehow, tempers cooled, words softened. Hearts remembered what mattered. Over a century after his death, the sun still falls gently across the Hales' graves each morning. The church bell rings as it always did, and the blue forget-me-nots bloom in quiet clusters, nodding as though in agreement with time itself. Visitors still come, leaving small notes between the headstones, just as Thomas once did. Some write prayers, others confessions, others simple words of gratitude. One message, left by a new-lied couple, reads, "Thank you for showing us that love is not a moment, but a lifetime." The wind carries those words through the grass and over the stream, across the village Thomas once called home, and perhaps somewhere beyond the veil of this world, he hears them and smiles. The story of Thomas and Margaret Hale endures not because of tragedy, but because of truth. It reminds us that the heart, though fragile, is capable of immeasurable strength. It teaches that devotion does not end when life does, and that the greatest acts of love are often the quietest ones, the ones no one sees but everyone feels. In the end, Thomas Hale's greatest creation was not something carved from wood, but something eternal, the legacy of love that refused to die. And so, in the quiet village of Eversfield, long after names have faded from memory, the message remains as clear as ever. Love is stronger than time.